Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is the Death Maskathon. Yeah, okay. From the most ancient of times to the master of forbidden technology, I present to you my Hall of Death Masks. Have fun, guys. So the gatekeeping program really wants us to believe that the ritual use of death masks begins in ancient Egypt. Allegedly, the practice begins as a way to honor the dead and help the spirit find its body for the journey through the afterlife, just in case it didn't recognize its mummified remains. This practice grew to include life masks, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, but also the ritual use of masks of the gods like Horus and Anubis. And I love this, this Horus mask here. But of course, we know that Egypt wasn't the first advanced civilization, so I think it's safe to assume that similar practices were happening earlier in places like Sumer, with its massive ziggurats, or perhaps in places like Mohenjo-Daro from the Indus Valley civilization, which is a lot older than what mainstream history and science tells us. And I think it's interesting that Mohenjo-Daro means Mound of the Dead, which is kind of similar to Çatalhöyük in a way, and may connect the two in some fashion, but that would be a story for another day. And of course, we shouldn't forget the Far East. They like making masks in China, right? And the practice could go as far back as 8500 BC, which is concurrent with that Çatalhöyük timeline. And this is just a quick Google search of ancient Chinese masks here. But I think my point is made, right? Death masks have been around forever and possibly a far older practice than what they tell us from ancient Egypt. And these very ornate ones, these gold ones with the precious stones, if they're not forgeries, which I think most of them probably are, but if they're not, they were reserved for the elite, like the boy King Tut here. And of course, never ones to let a good trend go to waste. The Romans got in on this, right? And the thing that's really amazing about the Roman death masks is that they were called imagines. And this blew my mind, of course, having just connected the Howard family to a waxworks exhibit in 1891 and Ron Howard to his Imagine Entertainment Group. And the fact that the author of this article bylines it with how Baltimoreans rang the changes on the idea of living pictures 30 years ago. Living pictures, of course, being movies or as I pointed out, like these waxworks were these still music videos. They really did sell the idea of waxworks as living pictures. So now, considering that the Romans called their death masks imagines, and that they were made out of wax, and Ron Howard calls his entertainment empire Imagine Entertainment, and we have a semi-permanent wax tableau exhibit at Howard's Auditorium, I'm finding it less and less a coincidence. So I want to take a closer look at these Roman imagines, and this is where the story starts to get really interesting, because it led me to the practice of ius imaginum. So apparently imaging was a fairly common practice for the wealthy Roman patrician, and the images made, usually from wax, were passed down from generation to generation, and at holidays and funerals, they would be brought out and lined up, literally creating a visual family tree going back however many generations you had. Here we have a statue of a Roman patrician who proudly displays the portraits of his ancestors. This is ius imaginum. And one of those religious festivals was Saturnalia, especially the closing days, which were known as Sigliaria, on account of the custom of making, towards the end of the festival, presents of wax models of fruits and waxen statuettes, which were fashioned by the Sigliari. And during the festival, these Sigliari here, they had little stands and pop-up shops where they sold these waxen votives, right? Because that's what we're looking at here. Just like Marie Tussaud was allegedly hired to teach the French royals how to make. Could the French royals have been looking to gain favor from Saturn with all these votives? And what is Saturnalia exactly? And so very quickly, Saturnalia is the winter solstice festival of the Romans that ends with the birth of the unconquerable sun, or, Christmas as we know it today. And it was one great big Roman party where the social norms were flipped on their ear. The status of slaves and servants was elevated. Roles were reversed. The plebes were treated as patricians. And the whole thing was capped off with a sacrifice to Saturn. And to the Romans, Saturn was the big cheese, right? He was the titan of capital, wealth, agriculture, liberation, and time. just like his Greek equivalent Kronos, as well as father of Jupiter, and by extension, the entire Roman mythological canon. And his temple, which was the center of Roman religious practice before Christianity, which was so important a place that it housed the national treasury of ancient Rome, and it was where the sacrifice of Saturnalia took place. Well, that temple sits on a place called Capitoline Hill. And here we have a model recreation of it, what remains of it today. All right. And it says that Capitoline Hill is one of the 7 hills of Rome. I thought that was kind of interesting because Baltimore is a deceptively hilly town, as I've said before. And with Baltimore being Rome in America, so I decided to look into whether or not Baltimore had ever been known for its 7 hills, or it was a land of 7 hills, or anything like that. I certainly have never heard anything like that, but as I was saying, it's a very hilly town. And so when I Googled it, I got a very surprising result. Baltimore isn't the land of 7 hills. Ellicott City is. Ellicott City is claimed to be built on 7 hills. Now this is very interesting to me because Ellicott City was the first stop of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, right? The first section from Baltimore west to Ellicott Mills, which is Ellicott City today, opens on May 24th, 1830. The B&O Railroad, of course, would not have gotten off the ground were it not for the Carrolls. The first engine room and depot, which went to Ellicott City, was located on land donated by the family of the marrow-slurping barrister Charles Carroll, whom we have here, right? And the first bishop in America was John Carroll. Rome has 7 hills, Ellicott City has 7 hills, and it connects directly to Baltimore, Rome in America, on Carroll property. Is this a coincidence? Maybe. But I know that sometimes if you want to hide the true value of a place, you make it seem undesirable, or in this case, not as important. Who was paying attention to Ellicott City? No one. Could there be some connection there? I don't know, but I think it's interesting that we have a model of Capitoline Hill here represented as it was, but there's also a scale model of Ellicott City in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. I featured it in my Locomotive Breath episode, and if you're ever looking for a cure for insomnia, I highly recommend that video, but I do mention this sort of like mud-floody castle hanging out back here in this scale model of Ellicott City. And so now, it just has my apophenia, my fat sense just going crazy as to could there be some weird connection between the 7 hills of Ellicott City and the 7 hills of Rome? I don't know, but I think it's pretty interesting, but maybe not as interesting as this, and that's that closing out on Saturnalia, it's important to note the obvious, and that's that the festival developed a strong Hellenistic flavor as the years went on, essentially absorbing the Greek festival of Chronia, which was a summer festival for the Greeks. And all of this happens because the Romans got their asses handed to them by Carthage in the Second Punic War. Saturnalia underwent a major reform in 217 BC. Until that time, they had celebrated the holiday according to Roman custom. It was after a consultation of the Sibylline books, and there they are again, that they adopted the Greek rite, including sacrifices carried out in the Greek manner. The problem here is, of course, that these adopted Greek rites weren't Greek at all. They were Carthaginian. And in Carthage, they worshipped who? That's right, Baal Ammon, right? This was an effort to appease Baal Ammon, the Carthaginian god who was regarded as the counterpart of the Roman Saturn and the Greek Kronos. So all these votives, these wax fruits and animals and the mask wearing and everything, all these votives are really for Baal. Is Baal the supernatural force that the French royal family is really trying to curry favor with? One can only speculate. But it's crazy how a quick follow-through turns into a tangent. But this all started by looking at Ius Imaginum. Let's get back to that. So, Ius Imaginum was a recognized and disciplined rite of the Roman patriciate to keep portraits of their ancestors at home. If it was a recognized and disciplined rite, then that means there were laws to protect that right of the patrician. Right? Not everybody was allowed to do this. And that's the literal translation of Ius Imaginum, the right to image. And I found this great article on whether or not Ius Imaginum was the first copyright law. It was published by Copyright Alliance on October 8th, 2018, and the number of 666s that can be culled from this date is absolutely astounding. October 8th, that's 18, that's 3 6s. We have 2018, so that's 18, that's 3 sixes, go twice. You can get a triple set of 3 sixes out of this if you wanted, which is really amazing to me. And I'm sure completely coincidental. But anyway, so what this article suggests is that the term ius imaginum was coined in the late 16th century, or what we know as the 1500s today, right? And presumably when the medieval monks were transcribing the works of Cicero. You remember Cicero, don't you? Right? Roman statesman, lawyer, scholar, philosopher, and academic skeptic. I love that. I like to think of myself that way. And his name recently came up in connection with those eternal lamps, remember? That apparently Cicero is the man in regards to our understanding of what the Roman Empire was like, at least during the era of the Caesars anyway, especially with his influence on the Latin language being as immense as it was, right? He wrote more than 3/4 of the surviving Latin literature from the period of his adult life. Think about that, right? It said that 3/4 of the literature of that period, of the Caesarian period, right, is attributed to Cicero. And it's been said that subsequent prose was either a reaction against or a return to his style, not only in Latin, but in European languages up to the 19th century or the 1800s. They were still using his version of Latin, I guess. That's what that's telling me? But just really incredible that that one man would exert this much influence, not only on the language, but on the history of that people. I mean, that is really crazy. Thank God for this guy, right? I mean, we wouldn't know anything. And I'm certain this is exactly what he looked like too, right? This 1st century AD bust of Cicero. And looking at it now, it makes me wonder if this was based off an Imagine, right? Is this an imaginary version of Cicero? Right? Because it's just amazing that the way that we accept these things. Cicero died like in 34 BC. Yet this is a 1st century AD bust of Cicero. So, if this thing is really 2,000 years old, at some point down the line, someone had to take someone else's word for it that this was Cicero, right? I mean, you have to imagine, hey man, who's this guy? That's Cicero.
Yeah.
What kind of chain of ownership could they have possibly had for this statue? It's just incredible to me that we just accept that these statues are who we're told they were, right? But I'm digressing with this, right? I mean, so let's get back to the article, where it states that there are many modern scholars that dispute this theory of ius imaginum. So one learned treatise describes the ius imaginum as a scholarly fabrication from 2 Ciceronian passages already skeptically regarded. So, throwing some shade on Cicero here, this guy is, right? And then there's another that says the ius imaginum did not exist with the meaning assigned to it by modern literature and may possibly be a completely modern invention. A completely modern invention, you say? It couldn't be something introduced to give explanation of how you have things like masks and wax portraits and things to your new populations and the future generations without actually having to divulge any truth at all, is it? Excuse me, Professor? How did the practice of making death masks and wax portraits get to Marie Tussaud? Excellent question. Well, you see, the ancient Egyptians did it and the Romans did it. Cicero wrote about it. It was a thing.
Say, go away, boy, you bother me.
But anyway, right, so I think this is just really interesting because I certainly didn't expect to find all of this controversy surrounding death masks and copyright law, just as I didn't expect to see copyright law play a part in Mrs. Jarley's waxworks. It's just unbelievable the way this is unfolding, with Tin Pan Alley and Mrs. Jarley's libretto and songbook here. So I started thinking that if the art of making death masks was protected Roman law, and we're looking at Roman and modern law just being extensions of the laws established by those in ancient Mesopotamia and the Middle East, then people like Philippe Curtius and Madame Tussaud would have had that protection as well, as would have those that created the Mrs. Jarley's Waxworks show. So it's looking to me like what our historical figures looked like and what their actions were has been copyrighted this whole time, or at the very least since the late 18th century, which is where we're looking at the last population reset getting its start. Now, I have no idea what this could mean, but it's certainly interesting to speculate on, especially considering some of the people there are surviving death masks of, or life masks as the case may be, because for a lot of these masks, calling them death masks is a misnomer, because a lot of them were cast when the subject was still alive, allegedly, right? And I have a short list here, and we have Dante Alighieri, author of the Divine Comedy, King Henry VII, father of King Henry VIII. Over here we have Napoleon, right, allegedly. Down here, this is supposed to be Beethoven. And we even have Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla has a death mask. Could the image of Nikola Tesla be copyrighted? I don't know, but again, it sure is fun to speculate on. But not only with this cast of characters and the others we already know about, but somebody else had a life mask made of themselves too. That's right, Honest Abe had not one, but two life masks made of himself about 2 months before his assassination.
How convenient!
Now, I don't know what this could mean for the story of his assassination, but given the hypothesis of what could have been going on with Marie Tussaud and the French royals, could John Wilkes Booth have just put a bullet in the back of the head of a dummy? Again, I don't know, but 2 months would be plenty of time to mock up a fairly impressive mannequin with a cast or mold of that death mask on it, if you were so inclined. But maybe the most interesting aspect of this death mask waxwork shaping of our historical narrative, which is what most of these masks and waxwork figures were made out of, which was of course wax, but more specifically, beeswax, in all its honeycombed and hexagonal goodness. So our hunt for the wax will continue in our next fun-filled episode of Baltimore Fat's House of Wax, right? Remember guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, and until the next one, cheers.